Hello, everyone. We'll wait just a few more moments since we just opened the doors. Make sure everyone can get in. We're very excited to have you here today. We have over 40 countries represented, a litany of healthcare professionals around the globe. I was really excited to see lots and lots of US government officials joining, this webinar. So thank you very much for the time and attention today. Welcome to Raphel Mechoulam, Adventures in Phytomedicine, presented by Dr. Ethan Russo. I am Chris Duvall, President of Cannabis Education, MM411, a division of Triumph Health and Wellness. We were founded in 2009 by yours truly, so I've been around a while. We are the global leader in cannabis education. Our historic focus has been with medical professionals, industry workers, now expanded to Japan, Mexico, LATAM, Australia, Greece, and throughout Europe. So we are on a fast sprint, 14 years into this journey. We are also expanding our digital platform to include horticulture, veterinary, psychedelics, of course, hemp and wellness, and culinary. So stay tuned. We've got a lot of things happening throughout this next year. Today, we're joined by Nisha Whiteley, Chief Operating Officer of Credo Science, and of course, Dr. Ethan Russo. Thank you guys for joining us today. So to quickly outline how the program and presentation will go today, very soon, I will turn the stage over to Dr. Ethan Russo, who will walk us through his discovery in science with his friendship of Dr. Raphel Mechoulam, who unfortunately lost just a little over a year ago. So I'm excited to hear about Dr. Russo's lifetime experience with Rafi. To be able to call him Rafi is a true, I can't even imagine. So the friendship runs deep. Following Dr. Russo's presentation, Nisha will open up a Q&A. So feel free to use the little Q&A button down at the bottom. Make sure that their questions are general. We can't be answering medical specific questions for your specific ailment, but please, we want to make sure that we give you the time and attention you deserve. And lastly, as noted, MM411 is expanding. And today you're the first to know that we are announcing our partnership with Credo Science and MM411. Our goal is to ensure that Dr. Ethan Russo's legacy is preserved. So this is the first of many different webinars we'll be hosting, and we're excited to already provide the foundations of cannabis therapeutics that are available both on MM411 and Credo Science site. So check that out. We will be adding this recording to that certification. So it will be available for those coming up, and we'll have a lot of new things coming, but today we really want to focus on the life and legacy of Dr. Raphel Mechoulam. Ethan, take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Chris, and welcome everyone. So just for context, this is an adaptation of a presentation I gave at the International Cannabinoid Research Society meeting in June of last year. But I've certainly added to it. I'm just going to make one adjustment here. So animation was provided by Jason Schechter. I'm very grateful to him. He's the managing director of ICRS, but the content was mine. So here I am with Rafi in the Scottish Highlands. I always tried to put him on the right in these photos that we took, and you'll see why in a second. As I'm fond of saying, Raphel Mechoulam discovered THC in 1964, whereas I discovered THC in 1970. Certainly the circumstances were very different. Rafi was born in Sofia, Bulgaria back in 1930. And there you see where it is, Black Sea on the right. To the left, cut off a little bit, is North Macedonia, where my paternal family originated. During the war, Rafi's family really went through some things. He was the son of a physician who was well regarded in Sofia, but who actually spent time in a concentration camp before they figured out that they needed physicians. And he managed to get out, and they managed to stay safe during the remainder of World War II, which was certainly not the case for other people around them. In 1949, he emigrated to the new state of Israel and entered the army, met his lovely wife, Dahlia, there, had the pleasure of sharing their company over the years many times. This is Rafi with his partner in initial research, Yechiel Gayoni. Uh, his family came to Palestine about 1840 from Morocco. And I was so pleased to meet him on Rafi's 80th birthday in Jerusalem in 2010. Of course, Raphel Mechoulam is probably best known as the discoverer of THC. But actually, the work began earlier. In 1963, they were the first to identify the actual structure of cannabidiol. Rafi used to enjoy to tell the story how he came into this work. He was a natural products chemist, and he realized that people had been trying to isolate the so-called active ingredient of cannabis for probably 150 years, but had never been successful. So he actually procured hashish that had been smuggled from Lebanon, got it from the police, and took it on the bus. And people were wondering in 1963, what was that strange smell? That wouldn't be the case today, where people are much more familiar with the odor of cannabis. So with Russo in 1963, they identified cannabidiol. Then the next year was the big one, the so-called active ingredient of cannabis, certainly the most prominent psychoactive component, THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, they identified in 1964. But the work didn't stop there. The same year, they discovered cannabigerol and had the foresight to realize that this was the precursor molecule to all the phytocannabinoids in the cannabis plant. But the work went on. Subsequently, cannabichromene, the cannabinoid acids, all followed in the years to come. It was not like it was idle in the meantime, but the next great achievement that people are probably familiar with was the identification of endogenous cannabinoids, cannabinoids within the brain and body. And this happened in 1992. Prior to that, Bill Devane, who we see here, with Lynn Howlett in the US, had discovered a cannabinoid receptor, which subsequently became called CB1. But the search was then on for natural chemicals within the body that would work on this receptor, much as THC did. Now, oddly enough, for research that took place in Jerusalem, they used pig brains to do this. So very unusual birth to this molecule. This work was undertaken, among others, with Lumir Hanush, who we see in 2023 balancing an egg on the equator in Ecuador, a story unto itself. But there was a big team involved in this research. So they isolated this molecule, which subsequently became known as anandamide. Bill was studying Sanskrit at the time and was aware that the word for bliss in Sanskrit was Ananda. And so they coined this terrific name, which has been firmly lodged in the literature. But the work didn't stop there at all. From here, there were scads of articles subsequently in the 90s about how this molecule functioned in different systems, and it was a foundation of what came to be called the endocannabinoid system. They followed on with this in 1994 with the discovery of another major endocannabinoid, 2-arachidonylglycerol, or 2-AG for short. I first met Rafi in person in 1999 at my first ICRS meeting, which took place in Acapulco. Here, you get a sense of, at first meeting, how gregarious and availing of his time and attention he was with whoever he met. So we see here Roger Pertwee, who of course was on the initial study of anandamide, also was the discoverer of tetrahydrocannabinol, THCV. His first paper in 1970, his very first publication was in the journal Nature. Very few people can say that. Also with the late Billy Martin, who was one of the deans of American Studies of Cannabinoids. Rafi and I quickly bonded, partially because of common background. As mentioned, he was born in Bulgaria to a Sephardic Jewish family, whereas my family were Sephardic Jews in what's now North Macedonia. Both previously had been part of the Ottoman Empire. In fact, I had a great uncle who, after being a revolutionary in Macedonia, lived in Sofia for some time before also going to Israel. Subsequently, we're skipping ahead to 1998. With his colleague, Professor Shimon Ben Shabbat, Rafi wrote this very important paper about what came to be called the entourage effect. This was the idea that beyond 2-AG and anandamide, there are hundreds of like molecules that seemingly might be inactive on their own, but when they're present with the primary players or the soloists of the cannabinoid orchestra, as it were, synergy is produced. And the next year, they followed on with another paper on the entourage effect, and had a very interesting name. Ganzi Gunu was the name for cannabis in ancient Assyrian. Rafi, among his other attributes, always had a strong sense of history, and he knew all about the history of cannabis and how it had been used by cultures around the world. But to read this, which has become, how would you say, this has always been a signpost to me of what kind of work we should be doing in this field. This type of synergism may play a role in the widely held, but not experimentally based view that in some cases, plants are better drugs than the natural products isolated from them. When I read this, I agreed, and I regarded it as a challenge for my career, and it has been ever since. 25 years have passed, and I am pleased to say that we now have a great amount of experimental evidence that proves what they were claiming, that there is an entourage effect that pertains to cannabis as well as many other botanical medicines. And to work on this, John McPartland and I shared an interest in terpenoids, which with cannabinoids are the main active components of cannabis-based medicines. Prior to this paper, there had been papers that were analytical in terms of the terpenoids that appeared in cannabis, some 200 in number at this point, but no one had written about their medical effects and how they might produce synergy with THC and other cannabinoids. So we wrote this paper, which was published in a journal that I happened to found and edit, the Journal of Cannabis Therapeutics. That same year, I also published this book, the Handbook of Psychotropic Herbs. There was a chapter in there about fatty acids and their effects on the brain and other systems. I always held out a lot of interest in this molecule that's highlighted, docosahexaenoic acid, or DHA for short. This is extremely important because as an essential fatty acid, it's something that we have to get in our diet. Unlike most animals, humans can't synthesize this. And it is so important because it is part of the cell membranes in brain cells and throughout the nervous system. Um, it appears in the diet, mainly in fish and game. And that's why a salmon is here. Of course, a salmon isn't an herb, but um, that is a good source. I knew that Rafi had been doing extensive work on the endocannabinoids and related molecules and had identified many fatty acids that were basis for the formation of the endocannabinoids. Every time we met, I would bother him with the question, have you found an endocannabinoid based on the DHA molecule? And he was strangely silent. Something I can tell you about Rafi is he was an incredibly generous person, but he was also very competitive. And I wondered the reason for his silence until many years later. We were on a bus together in London, and he whispered in my ear that they'd found a uh, a fatty acid. Um, they had found an endocannabinoid based on DHA, and that it had a remarkable ability to help build bone, and that this could be developed as a treatment for osteoporosis. Now we're going to go off on a tangent, and this is going to happen a lot of times in this talk. We're suddenly going to go off to Morocco. I'd been fascinated with a paper from the 90s from Jamaica in which Professor West had said that the fishermen in Jamaica would actually drink a tincture of cannabis before they went out fishing at night and were able to negotiate their way through coral reefs in the Keys even when he couldn't see anything. That same year, the exact same thing was reported by my colleague Abdurrahman Merzuki in an article in French, and basically saying the same thing, that the Moroccan fishermen would smoke keef, kind of hashish, combined with tobacco, and use this to see better at night. So subsequently, we got together and decided to do a field study to see if this were true, and it resulted in the publication that you see here. And I would point out that any of the publications you see in this talk are available to you free at ethanrusso.org at the library tab. So you'll be able to find this. The reason that this is in here was I went to Morocco. I freely let people know that I was Jewish. And this was just not an issue at all. As Abdurrahman pointed out to me, this is not the way we deal with people. We deal with people as individuals. And I was extremely pleased that everywhere I went, um, uh, for people that were interested in cannabis, they always asked me about Professor Mechoulam, how I knew him and what kind of fellow he was. So a prime example of science transcending politics. It was just a few weeks later after my trip in 2002 that I presented at ICRS a study which had become an obsession of mine, looking for cannabinoid functions in plants other than cannabis. And this was undertaken with Rafi and his team. My dear friend Esther Frida, who again we've lost in the interim, Shimon Ben Shabbat again, and my colleague at the University of Montana, Keith Parker, who did the work on the serotonin side. So I'd been fascinated with this report from Ecuador about a plant that's called here Dalbergeria picta, but these damn botanical taxonomists can't get their act together and are constantly changing names. So this is otherwise known as Columnia ericae. So this is a gesneriad, a member of the African violet family. And what piqued my interest was that it was reported that the leaf was smoked by the Siona Sequoia tribes in Ecuador like tobacco, but it didn't say why or what the effect was. Could this have cannabinoids in it? So we looked, and unfortunately, for my hypothesis, no activity was seen at the CB1 receptor. However, it was highly active at the serotonin 2A receptor, which some of you may realize is also the site where various psychedelic drugs work. Um, and this was able to displace ketanserin, which is a ligand for the 5-HT2A, serotonin 2A receptor. Unfortunately, we never had the funding to look further in the source of this, but like many other plants, it could be dimethyltryptamine or some other psychoactive molecule. This is a picture. I actually grew this in what I called the Amazonian jungle in exile, which took up the foyer entry to our house in Montana at the time. The other plant I was interested in was Salvia divinorum, which active ingredient seems to be this thing called salvinorin A, which is a dissociative hallucinogen, and people will smoke the plant or its concentrate to go off on a short trip. So again, we studied this. This is the molecule, a rather hairy looking thing. Um, Once again, we didn't see any activity of salvinorin A as an isolate, but interestingly, the leaf extract was active. And again, we really didn't have the resources at the time to figure out why. Plus, we were sort of upstaged. 6 weeks after the presentation, Roth et al. Did this study of salvinorin A. And as you see here, it had one peak. It turned out to be a specific kappa opioid agonist. So working on the endorphin and enkephalin system. Now compare that to what happens with lysergic acid diethylamide, or better known as LSD. You see that it is rather promiscuous at various receptors, including almost all the serotonin receptors, and then a bunch of others as well. So we really didn't pursue this, but it still remains a question in my mind whether there's a relationship between salvinorin A and the cannabinoids. Additional work was done, and they confirmed only low affinity of salvinorin at CB1, and it didn't affect endocannabinoid degradation, so it wasn't affecting the fatty acid amino hydrolase enzyme that breaks down the cannabinoids. The following year, it was shown that salvinorin A did interact with the kappa opioid receptor when it was forming a heterodimer or sort of a dual receptor with CB1. So there may still be something there. We didn't publish this at the time, but I did include these data in a later paper, which we'll see subsequently. In 2004, Rafi actually called me one day, which was not a common occurrence, but to invite me to write the first chapter of what he said was going to be his last book. Now, like so many other things, he went on to be author editor of one more book, but nonetheless, I was extremely pleased to have this role. He thought he needed a historical chapter and wondered if I'd be interested in doing it about cannabis in India. Well, little did he know at the time that for 8 years I had been amassing data on historical uses of cannabis in India, and suddenly I had the vehicle for publishing it. And I'll just read from the first part. India is a land steeped in faith and mysticism. Ayurveda, combining the Sanskrit words for life and knowledge, is a system of medicine intertwined inextricably with these traits. that a core belief combined with empirical experimentation could produce a viable medical regimen still widely practiced after well over 3,000 years is astounding to Western physicians. But once again, we have a lot to learn from other cultures and their use of plant medicines. And this chapter is also available at ethanrusso.org at the library tab. Subsequently, another tangent, you'll eventually see how this relates to Rafi. But I got another phone call on 2006 that this fascinating article had been published. And in this, a tomb in Central Asia, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in far western China, a tomb had been found of a Gusha shaman. And we'll talk more about who they were. In there, there were two receptacles that totaled 789 grams of dried cannabis. And it was absolutely clear from the photos and descriptions that this was cannabis, but there was no chemical analysis. Now, I do not consider myself a lucky person. However, what ensued in the next 2 hours was really remarkable because I sent an email to Professor Li Chen-Seng, the senior author on the paper, and asked whether he would like for us to do a biochemical analysis of the material. He said yes. I immediately contacted Jeffrey Guy, the chairman of GW Pharmaceuticals, where I was working at the time, to see if GW would do the biochemical analysis, and he said yes. So we were off and running. And over the next year and a half, the investigation took place. This is from our paper, but shows the original picture of the excavation of this tomb. Now, the Gusha were a Caucasian people that probably spoke an ancient language called Tocharian. And this was the tomb. It appeared it was skeletal remains. He probably had died in the high mountains, and because he was an important person, was brought to this area for burial. These are the two receptacles with the cannabis. And this is a layout of how things were in the tomb. This is the study site, and we'll show individual pictures. So this is near Turpan in Xinjiang, and you see that it is very inland. It is the most isolated inland spot on the earth, being 2,500 kilometers to either the Arctic, Pacific, or Indian Ocean. So a very remote place. This is showing you the local area. We have the Huayan Shan, our Flaming Mountains, and the Tian Shan, the Heavenly Mountains in the background. Nearby, Aiding Lake, which is barely got any water at this point. But you see minus 154 meters. This is the second lowest spot on Earth beside the Dead Sea. So a very desolate landscape, as you'll see. Just a picture from Google Earth of the surrounding area. This is the Flaming Mountains and the Tian Shan, snow-capped, even despite the aridity. So my mother told me always that I needed to study and be a doctor so I wouldn't end up a ditch digger. But look what happened anyway. So we had to re-excavate the tomb. Although the skeleton was elsewhere, various aspects of what was in the tomb were left there. They didn't necessarily know how important some of the material would be. Now, we happened to do this the day after a big banquet in which I drank too much baijiu, sorghum-derived liquor, and I'm pleased to say that was the last time I ever had a hangover. But looking at the climatic conditions helps explain how this material was preserved as well as it was. So it was hot, even though this was the end of March in 2008. The ground temperature was quite a bit lower, and it was a very alkaline environment, which does tend to preserve a lot of plant matter and a very arid region. And this is what it looked after a hard day's work of ditch digging. And this is the Hawaiian Shan, the Flaming Mountains in the background, so you get a good idea of why they were named as such. So later that year, this led to this publication, and we're eventually going to get to the relationship to Rafi. And just some pictures from the article. This is what the dried material looked like. You see there are a lot of stems and all, and some seeds. When the material was sent from China to England, where the work was done at GW by colleagues David Potter et al., this is a careful transfer of the material, wearing gloves, of course, to avoid contamination. But look at the degree of preservation. You can still see that there's green material in the leaf, and these sessile trichomes are still visible, which is just amazing after 2,700 years. Further amazing, this is one of the trichomes, and you can actually see the secretory cells where the cannabinoids and terpenoids are produced. And I've been asked a million times if we tried to pop the seeds and produce plants from this material, but as you could imagine, they were non-viable. And yes, we tried. So we were able to do the biochemical analyses, which you see here, and um, found excellent evidence, particularly with cannabinol, but there's also some CBD and various other oxidative breakdown products of THC, which identify this as a so-called drug chemovar of cannabis. And I would point out that the Gusher left many artifacts. There was no evidence that they used cannabis as fiber. Their fibers were made from other plants. And the material was so well preserved that we went ahead and did a genomic analysis of the material. On the top here, you see wild type cannabis, which has the sequence of amino acids that one would expect. But in this material, there were SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms that you see here and here. And if these were translated into what the amino acid sequence will be, you see that there was a change from the wild type from serine to threonine, which may have affected how this the THC from this material would affect the receptor. And of course, what we're looking at here is tetrahydrocannabinolic acid synthase, the enzyme that produces THCA and then THC after decarboxylation. So there were two unique single nucleotide polymorphisms. We still have a remaining question. These were never seen before in cannabis. Was this chemovar tech unique? And is it out there sometime? I would love to mount another expedition into the Tian Shan Mountains where this cannabis likely derived and see if there are wild plants there that resemble what they were using. When we redug the grave on that day, the original shaman's hair was there. This had been preserved, and you can see after 2,700 years, it's still there. There were other presumed shamans. There were other graves that had cannabis in them to a lesser extent. And so we decided to take some samples to send off to Jerusalem for further analysis. And again, this is very carefully done with gloves to avoid contamination. This was also compared to hair samples from volunteers in the lab. And this is the technique they underwent. This is very rigorous to avoid contamination, and how they had to be frozen in liquid nitrogen and then ground to powder to be analyzed. They were looking for cannabinol, cannabidiol, and tetrahydrocannabinol, um, using standards and with the best equipment available. Once again, we came up short. These are the chromatograms, but none of the three were detected in the samples, which is a disappointment, but not unexpected, certainly. But as usual, in his understated way, Rafi commented on the situation in an email to me. I am, of course, sorry that nothing came out of this analytical project, but I did not expect too much. After all, a few years have passed since the Chinese chief or religious leader or philosopher used his cannabis. So, what's the explanation? Well, there'd be three possibilities. Maybe the shaman did not use cannabis himself, or not in a sufficient amount that it would show up. He could have just given it to others, or more likely, it was just a long shot to begin with. In fact, we know from modern data that to look in hair for material, it's often in the femto to picogram range per milligram of hair. And certainly that, coupled with the extreme antiquity of the samples, it probably would be impossible for this to show up, even if it had been there. Shortly after that, I was in London again. Rafi, I had the pleasure of being with very often in those days. He was doing consulting work for GW as I was an employee there. Additionally, I would see him annually at ICRS and often every couple of years at the IACM meetings. Um, so we were together a good bit, and I don't remember this conference at all. Who spoke, what was it about, or anything else. The thing I remember was him introducing me to Jörg Gertsch, who I already knew. But the way he introduced me was why I remember, and it was, Jörg, I would like you to meet my friend Ethan. He has many crazy ideas. And you had to know Rafi to understand what a compliment that was. Um, Subsequently, I was also very honored to be invited to speak at Rafi's 80th birthday, and I thought this was really an appropriate time to follow up about the entourage effect as applied to cannabis. So this was published in 2011, and probably is my most famous work. It's been cited 930 times. And apparently, I'm led to understand that it was the most read article about cannabis for 4 years. In it, we went into the primary terpenoids found in cannabis, their activity, and again, how they might synergize with THC and other cannabinoids. As a tribute to Rafi, included citations to his work 33 times, and also gave tribute in the acknowledgments. Most of all, I would like to thank Raphel Mechoulam for his example, guidance, friendship, a life of good works, and for listening to many, many crazy ideas. And you see how proud I am of his compliment. Again, remaining obsessed about other plants and how they would affect the endocannabinoid system. This article was subsequently published in 2016. It included the work on Salvinorin A and Calumnia ericae, but also additional work that Rafi had done. Of course, he's best known for his work on cannabis, but he always remained interested in other plants. And one of them was a plant native to the Middle East, and that is Boswellia carteri, which is one of the trees whose sap produces a resin that we know as frankincense. Rafi realized that some of the activity of frankincense resembled that of cannabis. Historically, this had been given to condemn people before their crucifixion by the Romans as a way to keep them calm. The Jerusalem balsam, so-called, came from Boswellia carterii, um, in work with his student Aryeh Musayev, they produced 3 articles or more related to this substance, talking about its anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and antiseptic effects. They were also able to show that it worked as an agonist at the TRPV3 receptor, which is involved in temperature regulation, but produces a feeling of warmth on the skin and in the brain with some anxiolytic and antidepressant effects, and also affects oncogenes in the brain. Also, there was NF-kappa B inhibition and neuroprotective effects that were shown in mice. So overall, insensol acetate, the most active component, fulfills at least 3 of the tetrad features for which THC is known. Rafi also had many clinical collaborations. He was a PhD himself, but he had a broad knowledge of medicine. And among his more than 600 publications, he collaborated with many clinicians. One of the more famous but ignored for a time works was in 1980. He had supplied researchers in Brazil with cannabidiol over a period of many years. They made good use of what I think originally were 5 kilos of material, and we're able to show back in 1980 that this was an effective anticonvulsant in people who had been resistant to control with conventional drugs at the time. This research was pretty much ignored for a generation until the work was picked up by GW Pharmaceuticals, also in the US, with Charlotte Figge, and now cannabidiol, of course, is an approved pharmaceutical as Epidiolex for treatment of various seizure syndromes. He worked with Esther Shohami to show cannabinoids reducing brain injury. A very famous study was done with Delta 8 THC, but with very similar effects to Delta 9 in 1995. They were treating children who had leukemia and similar disorders. They were getting chemotherapy to see if it would work to reduce nausea and vomiting. They found it almost universally effective, and interestingly, at doses that were high enough to certainly make an adult very intoxicated, demonstrating something that was known earlier from the 19th century, that children under 10 are very resistant to the psychoactive effects of THC. In 1997, again with Dr. Shohami, they showed that a molecule that Rafi had produced called dexanabinol, which is not psychoactive, known as HU211 at the time, reduced damage due to head injury. That was licensed to a company subsequently. Unfortunately, Rafi said that they never checked with him after the license. They went on to use this drug as a single injection after head injury, and although it had performed well in a phase 2 study in humans, in phase 3 it failed dismally and was not pursued thereafter. one has to wonder whether the same molecule, or certainly other cannabinoids, when used on a regular basis, would not produce a much better result due to the neuroprotective effects of the cannabinoids. Rafi worked for many years with the late Itai Bob and their student, Reem Smoom, who is Palestinian, showed that the endocannabinoid system was very important in the prevention of osteoporosis. And we also already mentioned the example of the DHA-related molecule. And again, Rafi frequently had Palestinian collaborators in the lab, another case of science transcending politics. Rafi wrote an very fascinating paper with Paul Pacher about CB2 and its importance as a protective agent for non-infectious insults, as they called it. Additionally, with Yeshurun, they were able to show that cannabidiol did a remarkable job in reducing problems with graft versus host disease that appears in transplant patients. And one of the last clinically related papers was in 2018, showing cannabis safety in the elderly. And this again is from Rafi's 80th birthday. This is one of my favorite pictures. I was so proud to be with the two original researchers that discovered THC. I believe that's the end, but there is the man to whom we owe so much for all his great work over decades.
Thank you, Ethan, for that lovely presentation. It was truly excellent. As you can see by what's flying around in the chat, we've had a lot of people commenting, thanking you for, sharing this very personal presentation. The comments are super positive, heartwarming, as you might imagine. So currently we have over 266 people with us. We've had registrations from over 30 countries. And I think that, what we really have seen as a result of this webinar is that Raphel Mechoulam was a beloved researcher and that people are really interested in the science. And so we're super happy to see that. One of the reasons that we at Credo Science are excited about our partnership with MM411 because it's really dedicated to educating people about the science. And if you guys have enjoyed this presentation today, I want to let you know that we'll have at least 3 more science-focused Q&A opportunities this year. And before I tell you a little bit more about that, I do encourage you to put any questions that you have in the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen. So our next Q&A webinar with MM411 will also include friends at GCNC, the Global Cannabis Network Collective. And we're going to focus on a paper that Ethan wrote or co-wrote about proving the entourage effect with limonene and THC. And so if you have questions for Ethan or Chris, let's put those in the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and get started with these. So let's see, we have one viewer who is asking you to talk a little bit about the law of stinginess in the context of phytomedicine.
Okay. Yeah, so Rafi was really amazing for coming up with these terms. He was impressed with the idea that nature tended to be stingy. What he meant in context was that different enzymes could produce different results. So the same enzymes that produce the pentyl cannabinoids, THC, CBD, and CBC also produce the propyl cannabinoids like tetrahydrocannabinol, cannabidivarin. So it's this economy of function, and that's what he meant by this. Um, I had a different name for it, which was enzymatic substrate promiscuity, or ESP for short. So cannabis has ESP.
That's great. Thank you. So what was Raphel Mechoulam's favorite cannabinoid and endocannabinoid from a research perspective?
Gee, I never asked him that. I'm certain that he had a fondness for THC, although it was also a millstone for many people. It's possible that CBD was his favorite because it was the first. I don't know. I have to suspect his favorite endocannabinoid was anandamide.
Chris, did that come up for you in the interview that you did with Dr. Mechoulam?
Absolutely. I would say it's very similar. He's very proud of that and proud that we also are very much akin to a pig, our system.
Yeah, I should mention one reason they use pig brains is because structurally, pig brain is closer to humans than many other animals you might imagine. Um, yeah, uh, it's still a strange story.
All right, so this is another excellent question. So, what was something you used to think or an opinion you had that you no longer believe because of talking to Dr. Mechoulam? Did he change your mind about anything over the years?
Gee. Um, uh,
Thank Jahan for that question.
well, it figures. Boy, that's a stumper. In these things, I usually don't get stumped. There has to be. I'm gonna have to really think and get back to him personally.
All right.
All right.
Now we've seen it here, ladies and gentlemen, the first and only time of probably 10 plus years of working with Dr. Ethan Russo, he has been stumped. I feel like we should
And
send
we,
him on a certificate.
yeah, we have a recording of it too. So
I should
the legacy lives
point out,
on.
I learned a tremendous amount from the man and certainly count him among my mentors. Absolutely. But I still need to think on that one.
All right, great. So what was the cannabinoid that interacted with DHA?
Um, Boy, I can't remember what they named it, and unfortunately, they didn't publish subsequently. There were a bunch of these. Now, why didn't they publish? Part of the problem throughout Rafi's career was he discovered all these natural molecules, but there wasn't necessarily a way for them to be developed. And part of that has to do with you can't get exclusive rights to something unless you patent it. And there are only certain conditions under which you can patent a natural molecule. Now, some companies have gotten around it, but again, to relate this, why aren't we using anandamide and 2-AG as medicines? Well, in fact, they're not orally active. These get broken down extremely rapidly once they hit the bloodstream. Um, so, you know, Rafi also made all these synthetic molecules. Unfortunately, none of them have been turned into pharmaceuticals at this point. Again, they tried with dexanabinol, but there were so many that this could still happen. So, nobody wants their work to be recognized posthumously, but we don't need to worry about that. Everyone recognizes his contributions.
So it seems that there's a great interest in anthropology among our viewers today. We have the question of, are there any books you recommend on anthropological side of psychedelic use? What rights they used it for and possible meanings?
I missed a word there. The what at the beginning. The what kind of content?
Books about psychedelics in anthropology.
Um, Gee, I am. There are probably a lot of them. Um, certainly the work of Professor Schultes. there are many popular books. I think a good search on Amazon or bookfinder.com. Yeah, there are many.
All right, so I'm just going to let everybody know that we have 5 more minutes of questions. So if we don't get to your questions, I'm very sorry, but we want to make the most of the time that we have left. Excellent question here about cannabosum in the Exodus 30 oil. Do you believe that it's cannabis or calamus?
It is cannabis. Okay, so this is an area where we disagreed. Rafi was not convinced. So the word in Exodus was cannabosum, which means fragrant stalk or cane. The word in Hebrew subsequently from Talmudic area times on was cannabos. Now, obviously, they're very close. The Talmud was originally written in Aramaic rather than Hebrew. Um, he wondered about another plant called panag, or another reference. However, and I've written about this. There's an article that's available at the library, as I mentioned. Um, um, it's got the name Cannabis and Saga, Sobriquet, etc., where I talk about this. But um, there are reasons that this might be hazy. Certainly, cannabis was used by the ancient Assyrians, Akkadians, Sumerians. They had different names for it, but there are strong parallels between some of the uses there and what likely occurred in ancient Israel. We know from the 4th century that there was a carbonized fragment that contained cannabinoids, including delta 8, that is less heat sensitive, that was discovered next to the skeleton of a young woman who died in childbirth. And the supposition was that it was burnt in an effort to stimulate childbirth, which was documented in ancient Egypt, subsequently in 19th century medicine. So the evidence is there. Certainly, cannabis was there. It had to have a name. It makes sense that it was part of the holy incense or anointing oil at the time. We also have evidence from a place called Arad. There's archaeological evidence. They found residue that was consistent with hashish, with evidence that cannabinoids were there. So again, this remains controversial, but put me in the camp that firmly believes that it was there.
All right, and this will be a 2-part final question. So what would Raphael think about today's microdosing trend, wherein people are using ultra low doses of THC and other cannabinoids and terpenes as daily supplements for ECS health and support? And how would you like to see his legacy, his work live on?
Well, the first part, I think you would be interested in this and not surprised. Again, um, two-edged sword kind of situation. We know that excesses of THC can cause problems, anxiety, paranoia. If a tiny amount works, I'm sure you'd be all for it. Um, I expect and hope that Rafi's legacy will be apparent to anybody that works in this field. It certainly is today and should remain so for generations to come.
Thank you, Ethan. So all of us are committed to the science of cannabis, and it is really the science that has brought us to our partnership with MM411. And just want to remind everybody that if you are interested in learning more about cannabis science, feel free to check the link that is in the chat about our new course, Foundations of Cannabis Therapeutics with Dr. Ethan Russo. And so I'm going to turn it over to our partner, Chris Duvall at MM411 to give the final word. And before I do that, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Nisha. And thank you, Dr. Russo. I mean, it's always just mind bending to hear more of what you say. one of the things that we're trying to preserve is this conversation. We want to make sure that Ethan's voice is heard in all of these new certificates and courses that are coming online. So the way that we're framing it is to make sure that we record it. Nisha and Ethan have a very dynamic relationship in the question and answer, and it's a great team. So we wanted to capture that. Where MM411 has kind of their specialty, if you've taken any of our courses, is that we cite all the endnotes in the research. We really want to have anyone who wants to take a deep dive into the actual science that they can. So from what you saw, the example of Dr. Russo today, we'll go back through and create a digital file that you can actually then have all the research that's been cited and Dr. Russo spoke about. So that's kind of the framework of where we're going forward to preserve that legacy. And then I just can't even thank everyone in this global community for supporting all of us. It takes a village to make all of this happen, and there's a lot of hard days. But it's days like this that make me keep fighting, quite frankly. So thank you for the participation. Thank you for this partnership. I'm so proud. And again, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.